Under the broad awning of a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, Daniel Craig pulled into his newly paved driveway for the first time. The moving truck had left that morning, and what remained inside the modest, L-shaped single-story home was an ordered mess of boxes, tools, and the unmistakable scent of fresh lacquer from the custom oak workbenches he had personally restored and hauled from his old workshop. For most people, retirement meant slowing down, finding a quiet corner to sit and reflect. But for Daniel, a 58-year-old furniture restoration specialist, retirement was more about redefinition. He'd buried his wife 5 years earlier after a long illness and spent the time since keeping himself busy, refusing to let the silence settle into the corners of his mind. After 2 decades running a respected restoration business in Philadelphia, he sold the building, transferred his last few loyal clients to a colleague, and bought a piece of calm just outside the bustle of modern life. A yard, a workshop, and the freedom to cook over fire on Sunday afternoons, these were the things he had come for. The house itself was everything Daniel had wanted. Structurally sound, just enough room for guests but not a single inch of unnecessary space, and, most importantly, a backyard that ran 30 feet deep with an existing stone patio, cracked, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The week he moved in, he personally installed a custom outdoor kitchen with a charcoal grill built into brick, an adjacent wood-fired oven, and a cedar-planked dining table that could seat 10. It wasn't about showing off. Daniel was a man of precision and pride. The tools he used to restore centuries-old mahogany were the same tools he used to hand-sharpen his chef's knives. The pleasure was in the work, the craftsmanship, the control. And, for once, he looked forward to using his talents not for clients but for himself, and maybe a few neighbors if they seemed worth the trouble. On his second day, he met her. Karen lived across the street. She walked over as Daniel was positioning a decorative copper thermometer on the fence post, her gait oddly brisk for someone carrying a pitcher of lemonade. She looked to be in her late 60s, with iron-gray hair shaped into a tight helmet of curls, a pastel cardigan draped over her shoulders despite the humidity, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her voice had a certain sing-song quality, the kind used by women who wanted to be seen as gracious but were more accustomed to delivering criticism disguised as compliments. "You're Daniel, yes? We've all been waiting to meet you," she said, extending the pitcher like an offering. "New faces are rare around here. This street doesn't change much." Daniel, naturally polite, thanked her, accepted the pitcher, and made small talk, though he had the distinct impression she was less interested in his answers and more in surveying the layout of his property. Her eyes lingered on the grill, then the firewood neatly stacked against the side wall, and then on the motion-activated lights mounted under the roofline. "I do hope you like peace and quiet," she said eventually, "because we certainly do." It wasn't a warning, but it wasn't not a warning either. She didn't linger, just turned and crossed the street again with the same measured purpose, her white sneakers barely making a sound on the pavement. Daniel watched her go, an odd sensation settling low in his stomach. Not dread, not suspicion, just the flicker of awareness that he had stepped into a place with its own rhythms, its own pecking orders, unspoken rules. But he wasn't easily rattled. He'd spent his life navigating contracts, deadlines, museum curators, wealthy clients with too many opinions and too little patience. Whatever quiet power play Karen thought she was engaging in, he didn't plan to play. That first Sunday, Daniel did what he always did when he wanted to mark something properly. He cooked. He roasted a whole spatchcocked chicken over oak, slow-grilled onions until they collapsed into jam, sliced corn off the cob, and seared it with chili powder and butter. He played music, quietly, a bit of Miles Davis drifting through the open window, and shared the meal with his godson who'd helped him carry in the last few tool crates. It was calm, unpretentious, and good. He noticed her watching from behind the curtains. The next morning, a yellow note appeared in his mailbox. It was unsigned, just a printout with no official markings. Please refrain from outdoor cooking that creates excessive smoke or odors. This is a residential area, and several neighbors have expressed concern. Daniel stood in the driveway reading it, one eyebrow raised. There were no other cars parked nearby, no pedestrians in sight. He knew exactly who had left it. He folded the note once and slid it into his back pocket without a word. He didn't stop grilling. Over the following weeks, Daniel made his presence known, but not loudly. He was up by 6 each morning, tending his garden, repairing the cracked stone path, and working on projects in the garage he'd converted into a clean, dust-free restoration space. Occasionally, he cooked outside, smoking brisket, grilling vegetables, baking crusty sourdough in the oven he'd modified to hold steady heat. Each time, he followed every regulation to the letter: timers, thermometers, weather permits when necessary. Everything was documented, clean, legal. Karen, however, escalated. She began accidentally, leaving her sprinklers on during the afternoons, causing mist to drift across the road and into his driveway. When that didn't garner a response, she started leaving passive-aggressive notes stuck to his mailbox with blue painter's tape, always unsigned. Some of us have respiratory sensitivities. Please consider others when using aromatic woods. This is not a campground. Daniel said nothing. He didn't even remove the notes. He let them fade in the sun and disintegrate in the rain. And then came the gas. It happened on a warm Thursday evening. Daniel was preparing to roast a pork loin and had just turned the main gas valve when he heard a hiss that didn't sound right. He checked the line, which he had installed himself with a licensed plumber 2 weeks earlier. Something was wrong. The hiss was loud. Too loud. When he reached down and touched the main connection under the countertop, he felt it. The split. A clean cut. Not frayed, not worn, but sliced. Deliberately. He shut everything down, stepped back and stood still for several long seconds, staring at the glint of the steel braid in the fading light. His hands didn't shake. He didn't shout. He did what anyone with a grain of sense would do. He called the gas company, reported the damage, then called the local sheriff's office. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, young, polite, and clearly expecting nothing more than a bored retiree making a fuss over a squirrel. But when Daniel showed him the severed line, the deputy's expression changed. "This wasn't weather," the deputy said, crouching. "This was cut with a blade, probably a utility knife. You're lucky you caught it before ignition." Daniel said nothing, just nodded. He signed the report and requested a copy, then sent the documentation to his insurance provider and contacted his attorney. Not because he planned to sue, but because he wasn't going to let this get swept under the rug. There was a pattern forming. And though Daniel didn't believe in jumping to conclusions, he also didn't believe in coincidence. That night, Daniel sat alone on his patio, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a flashlight in the other, watching the shadows stretch across his yard. Somewhere beyond the darkness, behind windows that were now permanently closed, someone was watching him back. He didn't know what his next move would be. Not yet, but he knew this. He hadn't moved here to be intimidated. He hadn't built this life to have it undermined by veiled threats and passive aggression. There were ways to deal with people like Karen, civil, legal, smart ways, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of smoke along the way. By the following Monday, Daniel had replaced the gas line with a temporary one and scheduled a full system inspection through a certified contractor. Though he had no intention of escalating the issue publicly, he wanted every technical detail officially recorded. There would be no room for misunderstandings if things were to get worse. He wasn't the kind of man to make accusations without evidence, but he also wasn't the kind to pretend nothing had happened. The contractor, an older man with a calm demeanor and hands rough from years in the trade, confirmed Daniel's suspicions without drama or hesitation. This was clean, he said, crouched by the grill. Utility knife or something sharper. Not something a raccoon or critter could have done. Somebody knew where to cut to disable, but not blow the line. That takes awareness. Daniel nodded and had him mark the report accordingly. The report was emailed within the hour, and Daniel forwarded it directly to the sheriff's office to be added to the open case file. Whether anything would come of it, he didn't know. He wasn't naive about these kinds of things. Minor property damage, even potentially dangerous, wouldn't be prioritized unless something more serious happened. He wasn't hoping for that, of course, but he also knew people like Karen didn't just stop. She hadn't made a mistake. She'd sent a message. She wanted silence, and the fact that he hadn't responded to her anonymous notes or performative sighs from behind the blinds had clearly irritated her. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere around his home. Not dramatic, not overt, but enough that the rhythm of daily life began to feel oddly warped. Packages he'd ordered would be marked as delivered but not found near the door. One was discovered sitting against a tree across the street, partially soaked through with lawn sprinkler runoff. His mailbox, which he had recently replaced with a reinforced metal one, showed faint scratches on the latch, as if someone had attempted to pry it open and thought better of it. One morning, he walked out to find that the flagpole in his front yard, something he'd erected to honor his late brother, a Marine who never came back from his third deployment, was bent at a strange angle, as if someone had hung from it or slammed something against it. He didn't make a scene. He documented everything. Photographs, time-stamped, stored in an encrypted cloud drive. He made quiet phone calls to his attorney and had him send a soft inquiry to the local postal authority regarding tampering laws. He called his insurance agent, asking whether small acts of vandalism, if provable, might affect premiums or qualify for a security grant. The agent, surprised by the calm but thorough nature of Daniel's inquiry, offered a suggestion. Install third-party monitoring, something non-invasive but credible. Daniel took that advice. 2 days later, discrete solar-powered motion sensors and cameras were installed at key points around the property. They weren't flashy, they weren't obvious, but they saw everything. Still, Daniel didn't speak a word of this to anyone around the neighborhood. He carried on exactly as before. He worked in his garage. He mowed his lawn every Wednesday. He attended the quarterly waste pickup meeting at the local recreation center. He made coffee in the mornings and cooked outdoors when he pleased. He didn't give Karen the satisfaction of confrontation. Not yet. Then came the letter. It arrived in a simple, cream-colored envelope. The address was handwritten in fine, looped script. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of high-quality paper printed with an elegant serif font. At first glance, it looked like a wedding invitation. But the words were clinical, legalistic. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from any official zoning board or regulatory office. Instead, it was from something calling itself the Neighborhood Environmental Compliance Working Group, an entity Daniel had never heard of, and which upon his first instinctive Google search did not exist. The letter informed him that recent observations and collected reports indicated his outdoor cooking installations and use of aromatic combustibles were in potential violation of neighborhood ecological standards and could be referred to the county for review under Section 18 of the Community Air Quality Harmonization Framework. It was riddled with language that sounded official but had no legal reference, frameworks that didn't exist, section codes with no statute, and veiled implications of environmental harm. Daniel read it 3 times, noting how it was worded not as a direct threat, but as an invitation to consider changes in behavior to preserve community harmony. Near the bottom was a final paragraph that drew his attention most. We understand that new arrivals may be unaware of the sensitivities of our residential landscape. While no immediate actions will be taken, ongoing non-compliance will result in appropriate measures. We thank you for your anticipated cooperation. There was no signature, only an ornate emblem. Leaves, a compass, and a Latin phrase. Custodes, pacis, domicilium. He stared at the phrase. Keepers of the peace of the home. Daniel chuckled, the sound dry and low. It was absurd. Someone had invested real time into crafting this document. It wasn't a quick prank. It was effortful, deliberate, designed to look like the voice of authority, to blur the line between real and fake. A psychological maneuver meant to prompt overreaction or concession. And he had no doubt who was behind it. Karen. It was her handwriting on the envelope, he was sure of it. Subtle changes in pressure, slight loops on her ease. He remembered it from the first note she left before the gas line. There was no direct proof, of course, but Daniel didn't need proof to respond effectively. What mattered was the pattern, and what mattered more was the precedent he was now required to set. The next day, Daniel went into town. He didn't visit the sheriff's office. He didn't confront anyone. Instead, he visited a reputable outdoor catering company and arranged a mobile unit rental for the upcoming weekend. Not a food truck, a full-service outdoor roast station, complete with fire-safe flooring, certified staff, and optional shading. He paid in full and asked that the setup begin at 5:30 a.m. Sunday morning. He requested one specific placement: the edge of his backyard, legally within his property line, directly parallel to the back fence shared with Karen's house. He also confirmed all permits, reviewed local burn restrictions, none in effect, and notified the fire department as a courtesy. He did not invite guests. He did not post about it. He simply set the stage. That Saturday evening, the unit arrived quietly. It was secured on site. Daniel slept soundly. At precisely 5:42 a.m., he made coffee, stepped outside, and watched as the catering team began their meticulous setup. A whole pig, pre-seasoned and dressed, was hoisted and secured on the rotating spit. Charcoal bins were arranged, and the fire started with an odorless lighting system. No smoke alarms were triggered. There was no music, no voices above a murmur, just the sound of metal clinking, coals shifting, and the low whir of the rotisserie as the pig began its long, slow rotation. By 6:15, the scent began to rise. At 6:22, a curtain on the second-story window of Karen's house jerked violently to the side. At 6:35, the side gate to her yard swung open with a metallic clang, and Karen stepped out in slippers and a robe, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with disbelief and indignation. She said nothing at first. She just stood there, trembling, watching the pig turn, golden skin already beginning to crackle in the heat. At 6:38, she spoke. "This is harassment." Daniel, standing with his arms folded beside the catering crew, turned to her calmly and said, "This is breakfast." She made a sound, part gasp, part protest, and retreated without another word. The catering staff exchanged subtle glances but said nothing. They had been instructed, polite, professional, apolitical. By 7:15, the street began to smell like celebration. Daniel never raised his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply let the event speak for itself. He knew she would respond. He knew she wasn't done. But neither was he. The line had been crossed. And now he would set the tempo. Calmly, legally, precisely. On the surface, the morning of the pig roast passed without incident beyond Karen's retreat. The scent of slow-roasted meat filled the air for hours, drawing the curious attention of a few neighbors, most of whom peeked from windows or paused during their morning dog walks. No one approached, no one interfered, and no one offered commentary. It was a demonstration, not a party, a message crafted with precision and fire. By the time the pig had finished cooking and the catering team began packing their equipment, Daniel had already hosed down the perimeter of his yard and ensured every bit of ash, grease, or charcoal had been properly disposed of in sealed, fireproof containers. It was methodical, respectful, unassailable. Karen had no grounds to complain, and Daniel made absolutely certain of that. The catering team left just before noon, their truck silently rolling away like an extraction vehicle after a mission. Daniel remained in his backyard, sipping coffee, watching the fence line. He expected silence. Karen wasn't the kind of person to engage immediately after being bested. She would withdraw, lick her wounds, and plan her retaliation. He didn't doubt she had something in mind. The roast had pierced her carefully constructed illusion of neighborhood dominance. People like her never responded to that kind of thing with introspection or grace. They recalibrated, shifted tactics, came back at different angles. By the next morning, retaliation began, though not with another note or even direct confrontation. It started with whispers. Daniel stopped receiving basic neighborly acknowledgments. A man 2 doors down who had previously nodded in passing now kept his head down when they crossed paths on the sidewalk. A couple who had once waved while jogging now looked through him. There were no glares, no explicit signs of hostility, just a spreading chill, a subtle retraction of social warmth. It was surgical and coordinated, or at the very least inspired by something. He suspected Karen had begun whispering, phrases like aggressive, unstable, or disruptive. The kind of descriptors that could alter a reputation without ever crossing a legal line. She wouldn't outright accuse him of anything. She'd simply sow discomfort. But Daniel had anticipated this too. He wasn't here to win friends. He was here to own and enjoy his space. Still, the change in atmosphere was noticeable, especially when paired with the physical intrusions that followed. 3 days after the roast, Daniel returned from an afternoon run into town and found his side gate open. Not broken, not damaged, just unlatched and swaying gently in the breeze. He always locked it from the inside. It was part of his routine. The security footage confirmed his memory. He had latched it before leaving. There were no visible signs of forced entry, but the camera at that particular angle had caught nothing due to an obstructing branch. He made a note to trim it that evening and walked the perimeter of his property, checking for signs of entry. Nothing was stolen or broken. Nothing was moved, but someone had been there. That night, he reviewed all motion capture footage from the surrounding cameras. Around 11:47 a.m., a figure moved through the side yard. Low, crouched, barely visible between shadows. They had entered and exited in less than 3 minutes, staying low enough to avoid being fully caught on any lens. A professional? Doubtful. But deliberate? Absolutely. Daniel made a copy of the footage and sent it to his attorney and the sheriff's office. The deputy he spoke to took the matter more seriously this time, recognizing the pattern. Though there wasn't enough for formal charges, a report was filed, and an officer agreed to increase patrol frequency on the street for the next 2 weeks. Daniel thanked him, but he knew better than to rely on drive-bys. He invested instead in a complete perimeter overhaul. Motion-activated floodlights were installed on all fence lines. Audible alarms, not loud enough to disturb the peace but sufficient to signal entry, were embedded near gate latches. He added 2 more concealed trail cameras and replaced the branch-obstructed unit with a wider-angle model. While he worked, he noticed Karen observing from her upstairs window, phone in hand, pretending to be speaking to someone but clearly watching his every movement. Daniel gave her no acknowledgement. No wave, no glare, no sign he'd even noticed. But that didn't stop the next move. 4 days later, a citation arrived taped to his front door. It came not from any official city department, but from a group calling itself the Neighborhood Standards Compliance Board. The language was formal, mimicking official notices but riddled with small errors. A missing comma here, a duplicated phrase there. It cited Daniel for excessive ambient scent saturation, visual clutter due to mechanical installations, and use of psychological intimidation via food presentation. Daniel read the notice twice, blinking slowly at the last phrase. Psychological intimidation via food presentation. He almost laughed. Almost. But instead he scanned the bottom of the notice, found an email address and a phone number, and traced both through public databases. The email was a free account registered under a name that didn't exist. The phone number was a forwarding service, likely prepaid, untraceable without a warrant. Classic tactics for harassment through bureaucracy. Make it look formal, make it look real, and hope the target panics and conforms. Daniel, however, did something different. He sent a cease and desist letter through his attorney to the email and to Karen directly, not as an accusation, but as a protective move. The letter included documentation of false citations, tampering evidence, and an advisement that further interference with his property or safety would result in immediate legal action. He didn't expect the letter to scare Karen, but it served another purpose: escalation under controlled conditions. It triggered exactly what he hoped it would. 3 nights later, at 3:23 a.m., the perimeter alarm on the eastern fence triggered. Daniel woke instantly, pulled on his boots, and walked the yard slowly with a flashlight. This time, he found something concrete. There, beside the firewood stack, lay a small metal canister, half buried in dirt. It was the kind used for starter fluid, but this one was empty and burned at the edges. A crude attempt at intimidation, maybe even the beginning of something worse. Daniel didn't touch it. He photographed it, documented its location, then contacted the sheriff again. This time, the response was more immediate. 2 patrol cars arrived within 20 minutes. Officers cordoned off the area, examined the canister, and filed an incident report. One of them looked Daniel in the eye and said, "This is getting out of hand." He agreed. The next day, his insurance agent called to confirm the receipt of the updated documents. She mentioned that his security additions and detailed documentation actually improved his policy standing. He was considered proactive, not reactionary. He appreciated the validation, but he wasn't interested in policy margins. He was interested in leverage. He knew Karen had been trying to provoke him into making a mistake, something that would justify a real complaint or legal challenge. But Daniel didn't work in rage. He worked in procedure. He wasn't going to shout over fences or get caught on camera issuing threats. He would build his case brick by brick, calmly, with the kind of discipline Karen could neither match nor comprehend. The following weekend, as if to prove she was still committed to the game, Karen orchestrated her most absurd move yet. A group of volunteers arrived at her home wearing matching vests and began planting saplings along the shared fence line. She approached Daniel during the process, her expression painted with artificial sweetness. "We're building a pollinator garden," she announced cheerfully. "Just trying to bring some beauty and balance to the block." Daniel looked at the saplings, every one of them an aggressive vine species known for overtaking nearby structures if left unchecked. "That's not a pollinator garden," he said flatly. "That's an invasive species ambush." She blinked slowly as if surprised he knew the difference. "Well," she said, smile flickering, "it's all part of the neighborhood beautification movement. I'm sure you understand." He didn't reply. Instead, he emailed the county's environmental division with photos, requesting an anonymous inspection. 2 days later, the garden was flagged for removal. Karen didn't speak to him after that. But Daniel knew. She was quiet because she was regrouping. There was more to come. She wasn't done, and neither was he. Daniel had always trusted patience more than passion. In his experience, the one who rushed into confrontation often lost not because they were wrong, but because they mistook movement for progress. He wasn't a pacifist by any means. He'd had his share of hard moments, had lived long enough to know when to raise his voice and when to hold a line, but this wasn't a barroom disagreement or a spontaneous argument in a parking lot. This was methodical. This was a neighbor trying to fracture his daily existence with pinprick intrusions and a smile that never touched her eyes. Karen's tactics weren't random. They were ritualized dominance. She wasn't interested in winning a particular fight. She wanted him exhausted, second-guessing, defensive, and eventually gone. Daniel, however, had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. The weeks that followed the sapling stunt settled into a deceptive calm. There were no new citations, no more strange items left in the yard, and no alarms triggered on the property. It would have almost seemed peaceful had Daniel not been watching everything with the quiet focus of someone waiting for a trigger. He didn't believe Karen had given up. He believed she was waiting to find a new angle, a softer place in his armor to press. In the meantime, Daniel poured his energy into consolidating his position. He revised every property line record, cross-checked county permits for the grill, the garden, and the fencing, and ordered a professional land survey that verified every inch of his lot was legally compliant. He submitted all of it, not to provoke, but to preempt. The moment she accused him of encroachment, he'd have the documentation ready. Karen made no direct contact during this period, but Daniel saw her movements. Measured, subtle shifts in behavior. She began speaking more frequently to the neighbor on her left, a younger man named Richard who worked in tech and had previously kept to himself. Richard had once waved at Daniel during a rainstorm when both had retrieved their trash bins from the curb, but now avoided eye contact altogether. One morning, Daniel watched from his porch as Karen gestured toward his house during a conversation with Richard, her hand slicing the air with theatrical disapproval. Richard nodded, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't friendly. Daniel didn't react. He simply filed the moment away. Karen was building her coalition. Then came the drone. It was a small unit, white, with silent blades that made barely a whisper as it hovered. Daniel first noticed it just after sunset, a faint blinking light over his garden beds. He didn't move, didn't startle. Instead, he stepped back inside, retrieved a small pair of binoculars he used for birdwatching, and peered through the front window. The drone rose slowly, hovered above the edge of his roof, and then floated back toward Karen's yard, dipping behind her chimney like a guilty bird returning to its perch. The next day, Daniel installed a signal detector that could track any unlicensed frequencies entering his property airspace. It wasn't about shooting down the drone or engaging in a tech war. He simply wanted the data. When, how often, from what direction. In just 3 days, he documented 6 incursions, all between the hours of 6 and 9 p.m. He logged the timestamps, matched them with camera footage, and handed the entire collection over to his attorney, who submitted it as part of an ongoing pattern of behavior report. It still wasn't enough for formal charges, but it shifted the dynamic. If Karen escalated again, it would no longer be seen as isolated. It was on the 7th day that the first overt legal maneuver arrived. Not a fake notice, not a printed complaint from a pretend committee, but a real, documented inquiry from a local mediation board. Karen had filed for a neighborhood mediation session, alleging that Daniel's aggressive grilling, invasive cameras, and retaliatory landscape behavior had created a hostile living environment. The phrasing was careful. It didn't accuse him of crimes. It implied a toxic personality. She didn't want to win in court. She wanted to stain his name in official ink. Daniel read the request carefully. He had the right to decline mediation, but doing so could paint him as uncooperative if the issue ever reached court. Declining could also allow Karen to spin a narrative about him being unreachable. So he agreed. Not because he believed in its utility, but because he wanted it on record that he was willing to solve problems civilly. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a sterile office space downtown, neutral ground for the neighborhood disputes. Karen arrived first, of course, accompanied by a local paralegal dressed in business casual, carrying a thin folder. Daniel arrived alone, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt with a leather-bound portfolio containing every report, time-stamped photo, and official document he had collected. The mediator, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and practiced neutrality, began by asking each party to summarize their concerns. Karen spoke first. Her tone was soft, measured, almost fragile. She spoke of stress, of sleepless nights caused by smoke patterns, of being made to feel unsafe by intense cameras and aggressive landscaping. She said nothing overtly false, but her language danced on the edge of fiction. Her paralegal handed over the drone photos, grainy, taken from oblique angles, none of which showed anything damning. When it was Daniel's turn, he didn't raise his voice or respond emotionally. He laid out the timeline, offered documents, cited calls to the sheriff's office, and presented the surveyor's certificate. He finished by presenting a photograph, one taken from his own yard, clearly showing Karen holding what appeared to be the drone's remote control on her back porch. He said nothing else, just slid the photo across the table and leaned back. The mediator took her time reviewing everything. Her gaze moved between Karen and Daniel several times. Finally, she leaned forward and spoke. "I don't believe we're dealing with a communication breakdown," she said calmly. "I believe we have a pattern of passive-aggressive provocation that has been repeatedly documented by Mr. Craig. While both parties have valid emotional reactions, the paper trail leans heavily in one direction." Karen's face, which had maintained a mask of pleasant exhaustion throughout, flickered for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, but the mediator raised a hand. "I'm not here to render legal judgment," she said, "but I will be forwarding this case to the Municipal Dispute Office with a recommendation for further review. This is no longer just a neighbor issue. It's behavioral." The session ended 10 minutes later. No resolution, no apology. Just paperwork and tension and a crack in Karen's armor that Daniel had waited weeks to see. That night, for the first time in over a month, the porch light on Karen's house didn't come on. Her windows remained closed, curtains drawn. No drone buzzed overhead. No sprinklers ran onto Daniel's driveway. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was proof of impact. Proof that quiet resistance, backed with detail and patience, could force even the most controlling hand to hesitate. Daniel didn't celebrate. He knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't vanish after a single bad meeting. They retreated, reassessed, and reemerged in new shapes. But now he had leverage. Now she knew she was being watched, not by cameras, but by consequences. Under the heavy heat of a late summer week, the air in the neighborhood thickened, not just with humidity, but with a tension that felt almost visible, like smoke curling from a place just out of sight. After the mediation, things did not improve, they merely changed flavor. Karen didn't speak to Daniel again. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't approach with more notes or fabricated citations. She didn't need to. People like her didn't express retaliation with words. They broadcast it through social manipulation, environmental disruption, and calculated absence. It was the pause before the second storm, and Daniel, now fully aware of the landscape he was navigating, began preparing for the next stage of what had become a deliberate, sophisticated siege on his personal life. The silence was louder than any insult. Neighbors who once nodded now closed their garage doors when he walked by. Packages were dropped on the far end of his porch, left as though he carried contamination. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, eroding. Even the local coffee shop, where Daniel had once been met with easy smiles and simple conversation, now served him with quick politeness and no warmth. Someone, somewhere, had planted the idea that he was a problem. Not dangerous, not criminal, just difficult. The kind of man who caused friction, who made things tense. Daniel had no way of proving Karen was behind it, but her fingerprints were all over the pattern. She didn't need to scream. She simply adjusted the atmosphere, suffocated the space around him, and waited for him to leave on his own. But Daniel wasn't that kind of man. He didn't back away from pressure. He studied it, learned its shape, and restructured himself to endure it. He'd dealt with grief, with loss, with bureaucratic nightmares that would have broken softer men. He didn't flinch in the face of discomfort. He got smarter, stronger. He responded like a craftsman, slow, deliberate, intentional. So when the first wave of vandalism came, he was ready. It started with something simple, something petty. The garden. Overnight, Daniel's raised beds were destroyed. Not ripped out or stomped on, but carefully salted, enough to ruin the soil for the season. He found the white grains in the morning, glinting like sand under the soft dawn light. He took a sample, ran a basic chemical test, and confirmed the presence of sodium chloride in levels too high for coincidence. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't accidental. Someone had poisoned his garden to send a message. Daniel didn't rage. He didn't scream into the sky or threaten retribution. He documented. He took samples, called an environmental lab in the next county, and had the soil analyzed and the results notarized. He forwarded the documentation to his attorney and to the local sheriff's office. He also upgraded his perimeter lighting and added a ground-level sensor grid. Low profile, invisible to the eye, but sensitive to movement over grass. The grid linked directly to his phone and saved all data to a remote server. 4 nights later, at exactly 2:36 a.m., the grid pinged. He didn't go outside. He didn't confront. He stayed inside, watched the footage in real time, and saw the shape of a figure cloaked in darkness moving along the back fence line. No tools, no property damage, just presence. A reminder, a performance. The footage, saved in HD, was forwarded within the hour to the authorities. This time, they came out. 2 deputies reviewed the footage on site. One walked the property with Daniel, examining the footprints left in the dewy grass. Another canvassed nearby homes. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, and no one wanted to speculate. Karen's house remained dark, but Daniel noticed something that made his blood freeze. One of the footprints left in the mud had a distinct curve near the heel, a compression pattern typical of someone with a slight inward pronation. He had seen it before. The same pattern showed up on a pair of gardening shoes Karen had worn during her pollinator garden stunt. He remembered the way she stood, 1 foot angled inward, leaning slightly as she spoke. Again, it wasn't proof. But it was the accumulation of signals that painted a picture too precise to ignore. The deputies left after filing a second formal report. They couldn't promise much beyond increased patrols. Daniel understood. The law moved slowly, carefully, and often with frustrating ambiguity. But the record was growing. And that was enough. The more documentation he collected, the less protected she would be by ambiguity when the time came to act. Still, the incidents continued. A dead fish was left in his mailbox. Not rotting, not grotesque. Fresh, as if purchased that morning, placed there deliberately to provoke. It wasn't a threat, it was theater. Symbolic, strange, and pointed. Daniel didn't touch it. He photographed it, called the postal inspector, and filed a federal complaint for tampering. Mail interference was a federal offense, and while he doubted charges would be filed, the act of filing shifted the tone. It turned paranoia into record. It transformed harassment into precedent. The next week, he received an anonymous email. The language was mocking. It referred to him as the Fire King and Lord of the Pig, called his cooking domestic terrorism, and included a photoshopped image of his face on a barbecue advertisement with the caption, "Burning bridges, 1 rib at a time." It would have been laughable if it hadn't come from a local ISP. Daniel traced the IP address to a location 5 blocks away, close enough to be one of Karen's acquaintances, perhaps even the same Richard who now treated Daniel like poison. Again, he didn't react publicly. He documented, submitted, logged. He began carrying a body cam when working in the yard. not to record others but to create an uninterrupted, real-time archive of his actions. If Karen tried to claim he'd shouted, threatened, or physically harassed her, the footage would counter the lie. It was preemptive defense, and it made her next move much riskier. That move came sooner than expected. On a quiet Saturday morning, just after sunrise, Daniel stepped into his backyard and found that someone had climbed over his back fence and carved a single word into the wood of his cedar table. Enough. It was etched carefully, cleanly, with a precision that made his stomach turn. This wasn't random vandalism. This was the punctuation at the end of a sentence, a culmination, a warning, or maybe an invitation. This time, Daniel called the police before touching anything. Officers arrived, took photos, and dusted the area for prints. None were usable, but the depth of the carving indicated deliberate pressure applied with a sharp blade. They confirmed it wasn't an animal, wasn't weather, and wasn't accidental. They added it to the file. And this time, something changed in their demeanor. They didn't say it out loud, but Daniel saw it in their eyes. They believed him now. That evening, Daniel sent a formal notice through his attorney to the city code office, requesting an investigation into possible misuse of property lines and visual obstruction by a neighbor. The claim was built not on revenge, but on a detailed complaint backed by photos and measurements taken over the past month. Karen's growing pollinator garden, which she had insisted was an act of community beautification, had begun to include tall, fast-growing ornamental grasses and shrubbery now exceeding height limits for backyard fences. The inspection was scheduled without public notice, and Daniel made sure to be elsewhere when it happened. The inspector's findings were simple. The plantings violated local code, had no permits, and posed potential fire risk due to proximity to structural materials. Karen received an official warning and a deadline for compliance. When she learned of the inspection, she lost her composure. For the first time since the beginning of their Cold War, she emerged from her house in the middle of the afternoon and stood at the edge of Daniel's property. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice tight, brittle, vibrating with restrained fury. Daniel looked at her, expression unreadable. "I think I'm tired of being harassed." "You brought this on yourself," she snapped. "This is a peaceful neighborhood. You came here with your fires and your cameras and your presence." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't move. He let her words hang in the air, poisoned and desperate. "This isn't over," she said finally, and turned back toward her house. He didn't believe for a second that it was, but for the first time, he had spoken truth aloud. He had made it clear he would not fold, would not run, and would not be intimidated into silence. That night, Daniel fired up his grill. Not a roast, not a party, just a simple meal for one. Grilled vegetables, a small steak, and a glass of wine. He ate in silence, the firelight casting shadows on the table, the scent drifting slowly into the neighborhood. He didn't look toward Karen's house, but he knew she was watching. The tipping point didn't come with a bang, but with a knock. Not forceful, not hesitant, just firm enough to suggest formality. Daniel opened the front door to find a city inspector standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, accompanied by a younger man with a camera slung across his chest. The inspector, a woman in her early 50s with deep crow's feet and a tired smile, introduced herself as part of the municipal compliance team. "We received a complaint regarding unpermitted structural additions to your backyard and possible violations of visual obstruction codes," she said, her tone neutral, rehearsed. Daniel didn't flinch. He nodded, stepped aside, and let them in. He had been expecting this. The escalation was inevitable. He walked them around the property with methodical calm, offering access to every corner, answering each question with measured precision. He had permits on file, digital and hard copies, ready before they were even requested. The inspector checked measurements, examined the grill, the fire pit, even the small shed he'd refurbished into a tool station. All in compliance. No violations. No red flags. After 45 minutes, she turned to the man with the camera and gave a short nod. He lowered the lens. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Craig," she said, scribbling on her clipboard. "I'll file the report this afternoon. Thank you for your cooperation." As they walked toward the front of the property, Daniel asked quietly, "Do you get a lot of these types of calls?" She paused, eyes searching his face for a moment before replying, "Sometimes. There's always someone in every neighborhood who thinks it's their job to police everyone else's life. Usually, they don't last long." Daniel watched them leave, his jaw tight. He wasn't surprised. Karen had finally gone official. She'd exhausted fake committees, silent treatments, environmental theater. Now she was calling in real players, using the municipal system as her next lever. It was clever, it was dangerous, but it was also short-sighted, because Daniel wasn't just surviving her tactics, he was collecting them. That evening he compiled every piece of correspondence he'd received from Karen, every citation real and fake, every incident logged, dated, photographed, and signed. He added the new inspection visit, the vandalism, the mediation transcript, and the recorded footage of the word carved into his table. His attorney reviewed it all, and within 2 days, a formal harassment complaint was filed with the city. It wasn't just a report. It was a narrative, a timeline, an architecture of systematic escalation. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 nights later, Daniel woke to the sound of voices. Not shouting, laughter. Mocking, slurred, the kind that stinks of alcohol and late-night bravado. He checked the cameras and found 2 young men, barely out of their 20s, standing on the edge of his yard. One of them held a can of beer. The other had a phone raised, filming the side of the house. They didn't cross the line, didn't break anything, didn't approach the home. They just stood there, laughing, gesturing toward the grill, pretending to piss on the lawn. Daniel recognized one of them as Richard's nephew, who had visited the neighborhood the previous week. The connection wasn't direct, but it didn't have to be. It was Karen again, outsourcing her antagonism. Daniel didn't confront them. He let the footage roll, let the insults collect. When they finally staggered off, he logged the footage and sent it to the sheriff's office. This time, they responded within hours, identifying both men and issuing them citations for loitering and disorderly conduct. Karen didn't come outside the next morning, but Daniel saw her curtain flicker. That's when he decided to flip the script. He didn't retaliate. He hosted a neighborhood open house. No roast, no grand displays, just an invitation printed on clean cardstock and slipped into mailboxes. Coffee, conversation, and fresh bread, the invite read. Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to noon. No mention of Karen, no mention of conflict, just community. And people came. Not everyone. Some ignored the gesture. But 4 families arrived, some with children, some with dogs in tow. They greeted him with guarded curiosity at first, but the scent of cinnamon rolls, fresh sourdough, and French roast coffee softened the mood. They ate on the back patio, asked about the oven he'd built, complimented the handmade table, and Daniel, quiet and calm, answered every question. He didn't mention Karen once. He didn't bring up the conflicts. He simply existed as a neighbor, not a warrior, not a victim, just a man offering coffee on a Sunday. The shift was immediate. 2 days later, the woman from across the street brought over a jar of homemade peach jam. Another neighbor waved with a little more warmth. A teenager asked if he could interview Daniel for a school project on craftsmanship. The narrative Karen had built, that he was dangerous, unfriendly, unapproachable, began to crack. That's when she snapped. Late one afternoon, Daniel returned from a trip to the lumber yard to find Karen standing on his property. Not the sidewalk, not the shared fence, his grass. She was holding a measuring tape and shouting numbers into the air like a stage actress projecting to a balcony. 6 feet, "This is 6 feet. It's not legal," she yelled, her voice echoing off the houses. She was red-faced, shaking, holding a binder in one hand and gesturing wildly at the fence line. Daniel remained at a distance, phone in hand, already recording. "I told them," she cried, turning in circles. "I told everyone this would happen. You brought this poison to the neighborhood." He didn't reply. A neighbor emerged from her house, startled. Another stepped onto their porch. Karen saw them, turned, and pointed toward Daniel. "He's dangerous. He has cameras everywhere. He spies on us." Daniel stepped forward and spoke in a voice calm and loud enough for all to hear. "This woman has cut my gas line, vandalized my property, sent people to intimidate me, and repeatedly fabricated violations to try and push me out. I've documented every single one of her actions. And now she's trespassing." Karen froze. One of the neighbors, a woman Daniel didn't know well, called out, "Do you want us to call the police?" Karen looked at her, stunned. Then she turned and stumbled, back across the lawn, into her house, and slammed the door. The police came anyway. Daniel didn't press charges for trespassing. He didn't have to. The report alone, now paired with the video, was enough to complete the picture. The sheriff's department contacted his lawyer directly that week, informing them that they were forwarding the case to the city attorney for review under the state's anti-harassment statute. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the lights go off one by one across the neighborhood. Karen's house remained dark. The silence was different now. It wasn't peace. It was the stillness of a fortress whose walls had cracked. She had thrown every weapon she had at him: rumors, isolation, legal intimidation, vandalism, surveillance, social pressure, and still he remained. Not because he fought harder, but because he refused to fight her way. She wasn't gone, but she had lost. The weeks following the public meltdown unfolded with the steady inevitability of falling dominoes. Karen no longer appeared outside. Her car remained in the driveway, unmoved. No more sprinklers mysteriously angled toward Daniel's yard. No drones in the sky. No anonymous letters or phantom inspections. It was as though she had withdrawn entirely. Folding into herself behind drawn curtains and locked doors, her silence no longer a weapon, but a retreat. But Daniel didn't let his guard drop. He knew better than to assume the storm had passed simply because the wind had died. Sometimes silence meant planning. Sometimes it meant consequences were catching up. The city attorney's office opened a formal review of the harassment case, using Daniel's meticulously organized timeline, security footage, third-party inspections, and the statements gathered during the police visit. A public hearing wasn't scheduled. Karen hadn't committed a singularly violent act, and the city wasn't interested in turning a personal feud into a spectacle. But a private mediation was mandated, this time with a city legal counsel present. Karen declined to attend. Her refusal triggered a default judgment, a permanent no-contact order, enforced under civil penalty, and an official reprimand for repeated nuisance complaints and the misuse of municipal resources. Additionally, her property was flagged for follow-up inspection due to violations discovered in previous anonymous complaints. Ironically, complaints she herself had hoped would cripple Daniel's standing. Daniel received the outcome quietly. No celebration, no smirk, just a final heavy moment of exhalation. Not because he had won, but because he no longer had to brace himself for the next ambush. The long, methodical dismantling of his right to peace had been stopped, not by vengeance or outbursts, but by discipline, logic, and a refusal to let the harassment reshape his character. The neighborhood changed too. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a bruise fading from skin. One morning, a neighbor he hadn't spoken to in months brought over a box of unused tiles and asked if Daniel might want them for his garden paths. Another offered to trade sourdough starter. A child from 2 doors down rode his bike in Daniel's driveway, waved, and didn't get called back by a frantic parent. The social chill Karen had conjured was melting, and though Daniel didn't ask for apologies, their gestures spoke to something deeper. A quiet recognition that silence had allowed harm, and their willingness to break it was a kind of penance. Karen's house remained still. Weeks passed. Then, one morning, a "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn, installed by a man in khakis and a polo shirt who looked relieved not to meet the owner. The listing went live in the same day. It was bare bones, no interior photos, the description generic. Daniel read it once and never looked again. The sign stayed up for 2 months. No open houses, no showings he could see, no cars pulling up to look. Finally, a new sign appeared. Under contract. And then she was gone. No moving truck, no goodbyes. Just an empty house and a silence that no longer felt like pressure but like air returning to lungs. A few weeks later, a young couple moved in. Teachers, quiet, kind. They introduced themselves the same day they arrived, said they'd heard about some old neighborhood drama but didn't want to get into it. Daniel welcomed them with fresh bread and no history. He went back to his routine. Gardening, restoring antique chairs, grilling on Sundays. But something had changed, not in the rituals, but in the way they felt. For the first time in months, he did things without wondering who was watching, who was judging, who was planning. The sense of siege had lifted,